What is up? Welcome to the Next Guy podcast. This is your off-season podcast for the week. We have a special episode for you today. We have an interview in our interview series that we are bringing back. It's been a little bit. We've kind of had some busy couple of weeks, but we are back with our all-weather fans interview. Trent Henderson is on to talk about Oregon football, and so that is coming up right now. I will say a couple of plugs before we get to that. We did an episode last week, our mega draft. I think it's one of my favorite episodes we've done of all time. So please go listen to it if you haven't. If you missed that one, we had our friends Josh and Kyle on to draft our favorite sports moments of all time. And it was an awesome episode. So go listen to it on Apple, Spotify. It's also on YouTube. So go there if you want to watch the video. It's really fun to watch because all of us are on there messing around, talking about our favorite sports moments. So it's an awesome video. And be with us on all socials. We're pretty active on there. Our TikTok is really getting ramped up. We have a lot of content going there with the Fat to Fast series. I'm still training for my half marathon, so if you want some updates on that, I'm making videos every Saturday and putting them there, as well as some content we're pulling from our podcast. So we are trying to ramp up our social media game. So be with us there, engage with us. We love to hear from you if you are out there listening. And with that, we are going to jump straight into our interview today, which is awesome. Like I said, my good friend Trent is a big Oregon fan. He has a lot of insight. He has been a fan for a long time, went to a lot of games. It's really interesting listening to him talk about some stuff on the West Coast and how it may be different than life in the South. In the SEC, he still follows Oregon football. And he has a lot of interesting things to say about some of the differences between the two. So, listen to this interview. It's awesome. And we hope you have a great week. All right. We are here with a new edition of our segment for the off season called All Weather Fans. We are talking to fans of teams who have been fans for a long time and are diehards. And we're trying to get a little bit of everything. So we've talked to a Tennessee football fan. We've talked to an Atlanta Braves fan. Shout out to Josh. And today we have one of my good friends, and he's here to talk about a team that maybe we don't think about a lot here in this part of the nation, the Oregon Ducks football team. And so here I have Trent with me.
What up?
Yeah. I know this guy for like 43 seconds. I already have a really good feeling about this interview. Just have a great feeling about it.
Wow.
Yeah.
Thanks,
the
Mason.
honor, man.
Don't mean to hype it up too much, but it's already been hyped. So don't let us down.
The bar's been set high.
That's right.
Trent is here with me at my house, and we're recording together. Trent, why don't you introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about your background, where you come from, and maybe a little bit about who you are.
Yeah. So, thanks for the intro. Yeah, like you said, my name's Trent. I grew up in Oregon. That's kind of the title and why I'm an Oregon Ducks fan. I didn't just come to it because, but I grew up in the Mid-Willamette Valley. Oregon, the University of Oregon is like 45 minutes away from where I lived. Dad was a youth pastor for a really long time, and my mom was a hairstylist. We ended up moving out to Tennessee when I was in high school to Middle Tennessee, Spring Hill, Nashville area, because my dad picked up a youth pastoral job out at a church out there. So that brought me out to Tennessee, where I then 2 years later began my journey at the University of Tennessee. So I've got a bit of a duality to my my fandom, if you will. So, that's kind of how I got over to Tennessee from Oregon. But I'm also still at the University of Tennessee, despite having graduated in 2022. I'm doing my graduate program in aerospace engineering at UT. So I often get asked, didn't that quarterback that played for Tennessee get an aerospace engineering degree? And that's like the only question I ever get from most people about aerospace. Shout out Josh Jobs. But
So if you had to say percentages of Oregon fan, you're 100% a football fan. What would be, and Zach's going to ask the questions, but this just popped in my head. What would be UT percentage and what would be Oregon? Because obviously you grew up there, spent a majority of your life, but you have to be somewhat of a percentage of UT fan there. So
no, yeah, it's I find myself like it's one of those things where if you find yourself kind of sitting between a couple of teams, you tend to notice one wrenches your stomach a little bit more when they lose. That tends to be and has tended to be still Oregon because I grew up going to football games there. That was kind of my childhood team. However, I think a lot of that has come down to in the recent years. Oregon has also had a much better chance at some of the higher level games than Tennessee has, but bless, they're getting there now. It's also one of those things. I think there was more at stake for a while for Oregon than there was for Tennessee when I first started becoming a fan of them. So,
I do think the beauty of the Tennessee-Oregon relationship is that about 98% of the time you can kind of root for both and they don't overlap very much. Maybe now that the college football playoff has expanded, that there is a much higher chance that they meet.
We almost played playoffs. Last season. They almost played. There was one game short and then somebody lost. I don't remember who it was. But to answer your question directly, I'm probably at this rate, I'm probably like a 60-40 split, probably 60 Oregon, 40 Tennessee. I've been around Tennessee long enough now, and they actually have some possibility of making some very good games in the future.
Yeah.
And I think that brings my attention even more so. But yeah.
So this is not actually on my list of questions I was going to ask you. So this is off the dome for you. Well, also I was going to say, Mason, you know something a little bit about having your allegiances split between two teams, right?
I don't know what you're talking about. You have also gone to Jacksonville Jaguar games with me. I don't know why you're.
It's a joke, Mason. It's a joke. Okay,
I know.
So,
do you know?
Tins is a big Jags fan. For anyone out there, he's been trying to recruit Mason for a long time. Sometimes with the Titans have been pretty bad, so sometimes it's a little tempting for Mason. He's
come to the light
it's like
side.
Going to the dark side. It's like Anakin. It'll for long he'll be killing the younglings. Okay, so moving on. The younglings. It's a joke, Mason. Okay, so I did have one question about you. You played football in Oregon, like when you were younger, right?
Yep.
Yeah, and so the question, I guess, was I'm always interested in the culture between like the South and other regions of the United States and how they treat football. So what do you think was the culture between Northwest and South when it came to like youth football and football in general?
Yeah. So first of all, it's kind of like a slight sidetrack. So the state of Oregon, definitely their kind of major sport that you'll find, and I think it trickles down from the University of Oregon, is track and field. That's a really big deal. Hayward Field, you'll kind of hear, is like the big thing out at the University of Oregon. It's kind of where Nike got its start and claim to fame with their shoes that Phil Knight was making with waffle irons over there, all
Heck
that.
Yeah.
But in terms of football itself, at a high school level outside of the big cities with the really big schools, you're not going to find quite the extent of the culture that is football being ingrained in everybody all the time. I remember I have kind of a slight bit of a kind of a lame high school football example in Oregon, not to diss Jefferson High School or anything, but we had about 356 people at our school total. And so my football team was 26 people my sophomore year, and I played basically every way. It was barely 11-man football anyway. So, yeah, I remember distinctly, this is a funny comment, and I think it's a great place to say it. There was this dude on my team, and I'm forgetting his name to save my life. He was older than me, but, man, he was a character. And he was like, I told him I was moving to Tennessee, and I was going to be playing football down there. And he's like, man, that's going to be awesome. They like serve creatine up to you in like doses down there in the South. Yeah. And I'm like, yeah.
Steroid injections.
That's how we're so into it in the South. No, but in terms of like,
that's awesome.
In terms of, at least in the state of Oregon and somewhat Washington, it's not as big in high school and leading up in youth. But once you get into college, and this is something I'm sure we'll touch on a little bit, what was once the Pac-12 RIP, now it's the two. But
rest in peace.
The football out there was kind of nuts, and it was different from everybody else's football, and it was really entertaining to watch. It's something that a lot of times the eastern side of the United States didn't get to see because they would kick off so late, or just the broadcasting networks were near the SEC, ACC, Big Ten, that kind of thing. So that Pac-12 didn't really get as much attention, which ended up resulting in some of their they're just the Pac-12. But
it is interesting that you say that, because I think a lot of the nation became pretty invested into the Washington team this year.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, they were a national contender and ended up making the national championship. And I wanted to watch some games because we know Michael Penix was put on a show and things like that. And the 8 or 8:30 p.m. start time for a 4-hour game is on the East Coast is what are we? This is horrible.
Even later than that, I felt like
I totally understand why they're doing it. I get it. But it's so hard to try and watch some of those West Coast games all the way on the East Coast.
Yeah, it is. And we didn't get it until we moved out here, and realizing that, man, those 7 p.m. normal evening kickoffs that you're used to on the West Coast are now 10 p.m. and you're getting ready for bed. It's kind of lame. Yeah. And you get those Arizona schools where it's so hot in the desert early in the year, they're doing games at 10 p.m. Pacific time or 10 p.m. So it's already 1 in the morning when they kick off. It's yeah, that ain't happening.
That is bad for business, in my opinion. I mean, it's hard to engage an audience whenever so much of the college football audience is 3 time zones over or whatever.
Right. Yeah.
What are you going to do? Have them start there in Washington or in Oregon start their games when everybody's still at work at 4:00?
Yeah, you can't.
Well, on Saturdays, no one's at work.
Well, that's true. But at the same time,
it's prime time. I mean, you want it to be prime time.
You'll be, if they kick off, if Oregon kicked off at noon on the Pacific time, you get the 3 p.m. games out here, and that's starting primetime games on the East Coast. So there's all these conflicts.
I mean, you do 1 p.m. kickoffs here is 10 a.m. kickoffs.
Yeah,
which is pretty wild on a Saturday morning.
College game day was weird for me on the West Coast because you'd wake up in the morning and college game day happening in Georgia, it'd be 6 in the morning, if you notice, when they would go to Oregon, to Eugene, it's pitch black when they start because it's 5 in the morning when they have to start recording for 8 a.m. on the East Coast.
That is wild, the difference.
Time change is crazy, man.
Maybe we should just abolish time change.
Everybody's on the same time. If it's night, it's day,
Just for football reasons, nothing
could possibly go wrong. Yeah, we just change everything so we can all watch football at the same time. Okay, so let's get into some of our survey questions here. We've already done this a little bit, so obviously you are a fan of Tennessee a little bit. Oregon still some, and we talked about some of that dynamic a little bit. Did you have anything else to add on that dynamic?
Yeah, I mean, well, I think you had touched on it earlier too. It is nice to have 2 teams that you're rooting for that have next to zero, if not zero, overlap most of the time, because there is almost never the case where you're oh, yeah, I don't know who to root for, because at the end of the day, if one of them loses, you have somebody to save your mood, right?
True.
I always tell people, yeah, you should really invest in a second team that's on the other end of the country that doesn't associate with the team that you primarily associate with, because worst case, if they suck, then your other team might be good.
Or they both suck.
Or they both suck, and then everything's a sad party, but it's fine.
Okay, so our first kind of real survey question here. What is your favorite season, your favorite team that you remember watching, rooting for in your time as an Oregon Ducks fan?
Yeah, so that one's hard because I probably started going to Oregon games when I was 5. My dad had season tickets, and we had the same seats until we moved. Basically, that was every football season. And so I got to see kind of the progression of
Mm.
Oregon as they went from the coach that kind of got them going was Mike Bellotti. That was like earlier in the 2000s. His offensive coordinator was this guy named Chip Kelly. Some people might know. And then began the chain of events where as one would retire, the offensive coordinator would take over as head coach. And so Chip Kelly enters the game as a ladder offensive coordinator for Mike Bellotti. Mike Bellotti's kind of already started setting up a winning program that hadn't been winning for a long time. And then enrolls Chip Kelly with this new offense that nobody's ever seen before and starts rolling over people, putting up 72 points a game with like, there was a game I don't remember which season it was. They played like New Mexico, one of the little preseason games. 72-0 was the final score. It was just some stupid scores. But in terms of like favorite season, I would have to go with, I think this may have been a Mark Helfrich season. So this was shortly after, maybe the year after Chip Kelly left or something. So they still had a lot of the good recruits in. The team hadn't hit its downhill dip yet. And they were, it was one of the college football playoff seasons it may have been Marcus Mariota's.
Yep, 2013.
Was that his Heisman year?
He was a front runner for the Heisman, it says. Yeah.
Okay. So that season, they went to the Rose Bowl as the playoff game, and we got to go to it. It was against Florida State with Jameis Winston. And that was, worth the price of admission in and of itself. And even more so to see all the Florida State fans go from being as cocky as all get out to couldn't be saying a single word, which is awesome. But that whole season, I think, was really cool because I was old enough to remember all the ins and outs of that season, get to watch Oregon's only Heisman Trophy winner that year. And then get to see that Rose Bowl get won in person, which was really, really cool. Really special season to be a part of. The unfortunate thing was, as it often happened with Oregon, was that they lost to Ohio State in the national championship. But
tough break.
I think it was the next season, to a couple seasons later, we ended up going when we moved out here. They played at Ohio State as one of the season openers, and we went to the game because we lived out here in Tennessee, and they ended up winning. They beat them at home, which was awesome. They just kind of shocked Ohio State on their own turf, which was pretty cool.
Love that.
So 2013 season, it sounds like was the one.
It may actually have been 2014.
2014, one of those two.
Just saying.
I have a follow-up question. Well, I have a statement and a follow-up question. Statement: Mike Bellotti sounds like a mobster. Like a name,
right?
Like
might have been.
Yeah,
I thought he should start like a Pilates class, like Belotti's Pilates. That would have been a great move.
That's pretty good, actually. And then second thing, since we're talking about Mariota, I hope I don't snipe Zach here, but did you moving out to Tennessee transfer you into a Titans fan because of Marcus Mariota?
Mariota.
Right. That didn't work out. It's fine. I blame that on Vrabel. No, it's it was ironic for sure because the talk had already been like we're moving, and then Mariota went out, and we're like, well, now it's just destined, right?
Yeah.
But kind of in a way, I often still struggle to follow NFL until like postseason play, because I'm very attracted to the hype of college football. I've always felt like I know there's a lot at stake to be like the world champion of football, but at the same time I feel, and that's another conversation, right? Like the whole change with how players are now being paid and everything. It felt like there was and somewhat still is kind of like this major like trying to make it in the football world a little bit more, and the fandom hype I think has always got me a little bit more. So yes and no. I didn't really directly fall into it, but I appreciated it.
I'm just trying to recruit more, even though
and
calling out my fandom.
I didn't really I didn't truly have an NFL team going into Tennessee because Oregon doesn't have one.
You're a Seahawks?
Yeah. You were actually no, I was a Denver guy. The
Peyton
only,
Manning?
the only, you were either in Oregon, you were either a Seattle fan or a 49ers fan.
Yeah,
Yeah,
makes
that
sense.
was kind of the weird, like, sandwiched rivalry.
Makes sense.
We have another buddy who was on last week who is currently living in Washington,
Mhm.
in like the Puget Sound area.
Mhm.
So he was talking about how they mostly had Seattle Seahawks fans where he was.
Oh, and fun fact about the University of Washington, talking about West Coast teams, and Tennessee, they're the only two teams that have the water entry stadiums. So University of
Wow,
Washington also has their kind of Vol Navy version as well.
that's pretty neat.
So
Interesting. Okay, another quick side note, but you mentioned the famous West Coast offense that has been moving towards the east pretty quickly now. I mean, obviously, Heupel has a version of his spread offense, and then DeBoer coming to Alabama, you have to
Mhm.
assume is going to continue that movement, where it's almost you have a team like Georgia, who's a very traditional SEC team still, like
Mhm.
hard nosed defense or very like offensive and defensive line based teams. Now you have some teams that have started this more West Coast style offense. What do you think of the two? Do you think that the West Coast style is going to take over the SEC eventually, or
I think it's fully dependent on the coach that's in play, right? Like Kirby Smart's got something good going,
right?
and he's going to continue to. I think it works well for him. But the thing I always have to remind people is, like, I mean, football, like any sport, is a dynamic thing. Like, over the years it changes, and as people's new like ways of playing the game occur, you get players that match that kind of like playing style. For instance, like in the NFL, you see a lot of these college athletes coming out of these spread and fast paced offenses
Mm.
that didn't mesh with the old pro style offenses, and so a lot of those old pro style offenses have gone the way of the dodo because they don't have any players to feed that system anymore.
Yeah.
And so you start to wonder too. I think that's what would kill that kind of like hard nosed SEC style, old SEC style offense. First would actually be the lack of talent from the high school level playing that type of offense anymore, which I don't know that necessarily is going to happen. I also think one other misconception that happens a lot of times is that, like, the spread won't work against some like bigger hard-nosed kind of team, which, yes, if you play them lean. So there's a lot of the Pac-12 teams, the offensive lines were like averaged under 300 pounds. So they were like super lightweight, super mobile offensive lines so that everything could move. Like, everybody was moving all the
Right.
time. But when it came to playing somebody like a Georgia defensive line, that wasn't going to work out well most of the time. They would beat them up after a half, and that would be it.
Yeah.
But you end up with, like, if you look back at the Chip Kelly original spread offense, he had a pretty hefty offensive line, and 60+% of his plays were runs. They weren't passes. He had like two big running backs and a small, really fast running back, and then some good wide receivers. And everything was based off of like being mobile enough to get to the outside, but they still had a larger offensive line. And Oregon's doing that now too. They have Dan Lanning, who comes from Georgia, and he's building the much heavier like team, but they still have that kind of speed to them.
Interesting. That is interesting. It's a pretty fascinating thing to see some of those. I think the different offenses have been so spread out that you rarely saw them head to head unless it's like in postseason play almost.
Yeah.
And now we're starting to see them integrate more, where you're starting to see, especially with teams like some of those West Coast teams joining the Big Ten too. We're gonna see a clash of like the Michigans and the like Ohio State's, like you said, versus some of those West Coast teams like Washington, Oregon. So I think it's going to be a pretty exciting year where we get to see a lot more of those clashes of styles. I think.
Yeah,
It's pretty exciting. Yeah. Okay. Moving on. You already kind of mentioned maybe a few of these, so you might have already talked about this some, but What was your favorite moment as a fan? It could be in the stadium, out of the stadium. It could be whatever you think. What do you think of as your favorite moment?
Oh goodness. There's definitely plenty of them. I was looking like in terms of probably one of the most memorable games that I often talk about. In 2011, there was a game on Halloween night. It was a blackout Oregon game against USC on the West Coast. That's Southern California, not South Carolina.
I think of USC as Southern California.
Okay, so like I came out here and everybody's like USC. I'm like Southern California. They're like no, South Carolina.
I've never
and I'm
called
like
South
what?
Carolina USC.
Anyway, so it was a blackout night. USC was pretty good at the time. They didn't suck like they do now. And it was called
Got 'em.
Fright Night, and it was a really good game. But also, I think probably a bigger one was in 2009. It was still the Pac-10. It became the Pac-12 in 2011.
Throwback.
Oregon versus Oregon State, Civil War is that game. They were both top ranked teams, and at the time, when it was still the BCS Crystal Ball era, they had the Rose Bowl would take generally the winner from the Pac-12 or the winner from the Pac-10 and the winner of the Big Ten national title game, and then they would play each other in the Rose Bowl. Now, the Big Ten had, I think, a championship game. The Pac-10 did not. But maybe at that time,
Cowards.
I can't remember. They didn't have enough teams. So they would end up this Civil War was called the War for the Roses because they basically, whoever won that game had an automatic berth into the Rose Bowl. And so it was at Autzen, and it was like super loud. A ton of Oregon State fans. Corvallis, where Oregon State is like 30 minutes away from Eugene, so they're like right next to each other, and so you get all kinds of these cool Civil War games. But that was probably a big one because the stakes were so high. But we still didn't have a championship game yet until the next year, and so it was just like your season ends here to a Lane Bowl game, or you get to go to the Rose Bowl. So Oregon ended up winning that one and going to the Rose Bowl after that. So.
Him explaining all that, it feels like that was like forever ago with how different college football is now, but it realistically wasn't that long ago. But now we're literally talking about next year having a 12-team playoff, and he was just explaining like the different bowls and and now it's just crazy. Like
when there was the New Year's Six and every one of them was their own thing. Yeah.
Those were the days. Not anymore.
It's true. It's true. Okay. So on the other flip side of that, we're talking about most heartbreaking moment or game. You mentioned losing the national championship.
Yep. Twice.
Oh, tough.
Yeah, rough.
Couldn't beat Tennessee.
Yeah, so
we just never get there.
There's been a ton. Oregon has had a ton of like kind of like Tennessee did what was it 2 seasons ago now where they lost to South Carolina right at the last second.
2022, yep.
They've had a number of those where they're like top 7 team and they're just knocking on the door for being in a title contender and they miss a field goal or something stupid happens. There's been a ton of those. So I feel for Tennessee every time it's happened because I understand. But probably the worst one was not the Ohio State national championship because it was probably a 2 or 3 score difference. But in 2011, which followed the first matchup between Tennessee and Oregon season in 2010, when Tennessee
smacked.
Oregon came to Tennessee, there was a giant lightning delay. I remember watching Neyland on TV for the first time during that from Oregon, not knowing where I would be soon. That was during the Dooley era, so
I remember that not going well. Yeah.
They were up high and then they died as soon as the lightning delay ended. But following that season, it was Auburn and Oregon in the national championship game, and it was Auburn in the Cam Newton era. And they were it was like a 1-score game. Like I think within, let me see, I have the field. Was it Yeah, okay, so it was 22-19. So it was one field goal difference.
I remember it being a good game.
And Oregon had one stop. It was 3rd down and long. In the middle of the field, they had one stop to stop Auburn's running back to punt the ball to get back down the field with plenty of time to tie it up and go into overtime. And this run, he was like blades of grass from getting down, and he didn't actually go down, and it was 1st down, and he made an additional like 20 yards, and that killed it. And it was like a 3-point game, and it was the most sad thing ever because like the first national championship I think Oregon had ever played for, and they were within 3 points. It was terrible. Yeah, that was pretty bad.
Yeah, there is something to just your team getting there and being in the mix, but then to lose, it's like almost as bad as not even being in the mix, because then it's just like you were so close to glory to fall short there. Becomes a pretty big bummer. Okay, we're gonna kind of rapid fire through these last couple, and then we're gonna wrap up here. If there was one, so we are not super familiar with the Oregon program. You mentioned the Vol Navy that Tennessee has. There's a couple other pretty unique things. Is there like a cool thing about being an Oregon fan, or is something unique and maybe someone who doesn't follow Oregon wouldn't know about?
Yeah. Well, for one, I'm sure everybody knows about like they've got Nike's number, so all of the facilities and stuff they have and the number of uniforms that they go through is kind of ridiculous. But in terms of kind of traditions and stuff that they do, so like Tennessee has the running through the T is like their entrance. Mm-hmm. For those who haven't seen Oregon's entrance, it is I don't even remember how it started, but they exit the tunnel with the duck riding on the back of a Harley Davidson out onto that's like got a Oregon Lightning wrap all over it. It's the most bizarre thing ever, but he leads him out and then the whole team like comes out sprinting behind him. It's ridiculous. But it's a lot of fun. Also, that stadium, despite holding a maximum capacity, I think without additional seating, it's 59,000 people.
Yeah.
But it's got a reflector hood and it's built into a hill. So they like built it into a mound. There was that Fright Night game that I was talking about earlier with USC. It reached 114 decibels with 64,000 people in the stadium. And I think the loudest I've heard Neyland is just over that at the Alabama game a few years ago, which I was fortunate enough to be a part of. So
electric.
It was electric.
I have another statement and question.
Yeah.
So the question is, you were talking about the uniforms. Do you have a favorite uniform that you talked about them having hundreds of them, but is there a favorite one?
Great question, Mason.
It is solid.
Thank you.
And thanks to the new EA game, we've got a bajillion of them also.
Yeah.
I think my favorite regularly that they go with is like they have like this apple green color that they'll do, like this bright green out. If you watch any of the Civil War games, Oregon will the last I don't know how many years they won't wear an away color anymore because the team colors are so starkly different. They'll wear this giant bright apple green and neon yellow, and then Oregon State will wear this like fluorescent orange and black, and awesome. They're like it's like color rush in the NFL. It's like two very highlighter games.
There's a couple of other rivals who do the same thing. I forget which. There's one in the SEC that does it, and they just. I think there's actually. I know in the SEC there's a penalty for neither team wearing home colors.
Oh, like both wearing away?
If they're both wearing, because I think it's like against league policy, but they just are willing to pay it every year because they like to wear it.
That's got to be an LSU rivalry game, right? Because LSU is the only one who wears white most of the time.
No, man, I'll look it up. I know it's a thing. I remember reading about it.
Interesting. Yeah, okay. I was going to say the other one that they always wear is like these chrome helmets. Like I don't even know how they're illegal because you
look
can
like
see
mirrors.
Yourself. Yeah. I have no idea.
I feel like if you really wanted to, you just like lean down and get the reflection of the sun and like blind the quarterback. My statement was the Oregon Ducks did make my top 3 when I used to play NCAA for the mascot games. The Ducks was number 3. The Syracuse Oranges was number 2, and then the Stanford Trees was my number 1.
Those things.
So,
Wait, what year was this game that you were playing?
probably like 2009.
Okay, so it was the old
When was
creepy trees.
NCAA? Yeah, do what?
It was the old creepy trees that
Yeah, the
looked
old
like
creepy trees. Yeah.
real trees, but yeah.
Early
Yeah.
2000s. Smokey was also in there. He's probably like top 4. So,
Cool.
But yeah, there's my statement. So we could go back to the questions, even though Zach's like doing his research over there. But
it looks like USC and UCLA both also wear their home
Yes, they do.
colors.
Yeah.
Which has just been like a tradition. So it must be a West Coast thing. It says
West Coast likes to
Washington
go
State
against the
might
grain
also
a little
do
bit.
that. Yeah. Which is pretty cool. It's a cool thing. Okay. So I have 2 pretty short questions. This one may be a super easy one, considering how you've talked about them tonight. I'm going to guess I know the answer. Which team do you consider to be your biggest rival?
Biggest,
like most team. Whenever you beat them, you feel best about your
or
that
vice
you feel
versa.
Best about beating, or feel like terrible about losing to. Yeah.
So I would say like Washington by far is the worst.
Oh, really?
They're like Tennessee's equivalent to Florida.
Yeah, Tennessee's a little bit a toss up depending on who you talk to. Some people say Florida, some people say Bama.
The old school like Florida, Tennessee, that whole that there has been a number of like. I mean, of course, I only hear this from Oregon fan perspective, so I'm sure Washington fans have a similar perspective. But there's been plenty of stories of like Oregon fans going to Seattle and sitting in their games, getting crap dumped on them, and like dinner and stuff. It's like it's just it's more of the like nasty one where nobody gets along well at all, and everybody just like if you could have one team just to like open up and the whole world swallows it, that would be the one. Oregon State is definitely a rival, but it's almost like you and your brother's rivalry at any game you play with each other. You know, like it's like you have a bunch of friends because the schools are 30 minutes apart.
Yeah.
So everybody in that area is a fan of one, and they just trash talk each other all the time, but it's all like more good fun trash talk. Washington, they legitimately mean it, generally speaking. So Washington Huskies can.
So it's not Oregon State though. The Civil War would
be the second. Like You still want to win that game, but like if you had to choose to lose one, I would choose to lose to Oregon State over Washington any day.
Well, so the Florida rivalry really came to be because my dad talked about it in ours. And his interview was whenever back then that game basically determined who was going to win the SEC East every year.
Mm-hmm.
Like that game was the determining factor of who was going to go to the SEC championship. Like every single year, it was like that game was the only game that mattered. So I think that happened with Oregon. It sounds like Oregon and Washington are pretty much vying for the top of the Pac-12 regularly. Once that became a really meaningful game.
Once it became the Pac-12, the North often was between them. Although for a number of years, the North was between Oregon and Stanford. Oddly enough,
yeah, Stanford is falling off.
Yeah, but I don't know exactly how the origin was back in the day. When it was the Pac-8 and the Pac-10.
Right.
But I do know that like it's called the pick, is their big highlight that they always show like pregame. And a guy named Kenny Wheaton, you can find the thing anywhere, but it was basically it was a 3-loss Oregon, and they were at home. And the game was going to end like it looked like Washington was marching right back down the field and looked like they were going to throw a touchdown right at the end, seal it, and it would kick them out of like bowl contention. And this guy named Kenny Wheaton picked it off on like the goal line basically and ran it all the way back for a pick six. And it put them back in. It basically gave them a Rose Bowl berth that year, like automatically because of that play. And so it gets played all the time. And the history was, if I get it right, that the announcer who is yelling in the background of that video, he's screaming like Kenny Wheaton's going to score, whatever. He like was so hyped up that he had bit his tongue and he was like bleeding all over the broadcast.
Heck yeah.
Commitment.
That's awesome. That is pretty cool. Okay, so last question, and then we are out of here. If you could give us, it doesn't have to be super in depth. If you want to give us a quick preview of this year's Oregon season, obviously Bo Nix is out. Contrary to what a lot of people thought, Dan Lanning is back and not in the SEC, which is big for Oregon. How do you foresee this season going?
Yeah, first of all, I'm so thankful that Dan Lanning didn't go anywhere, but he made it pretty evidently clear that he was planning to stay by the amount of somewhat petty posts that he was making. But he also used it as the biggest recruiting plug out of the transfer portal he could possibly do. Like, we're going to the Big Ten, and anybody who wants to join our roster can.
Yeah.
They basically pulled the entire backup bench of Alabama. They pulled the top DB from Washington after DeBoer left that just got done beating them twice. He pulled, I don't know, they have a 5-star, 1 or 2 5-star recruit quarterbacks coming in following, what's the Oklahoma quarterback's name that went over there for his senior year?
Over to where?
To Oregon. Did you not know this?
No.
What was his name?
You're looking at me?
It's a great question.
Yeah, you'll have to find this.
We'll figure it out. Continue. Yeah,
I'm so bad with rosters. Anyway, but he's currently in the starting position, and then UCLA's quarterback that was really, really good left UCLA, and he's backed up to him. So we have two, like a senior from Oklahoma, Dylan Gabriel.
There
it is.
So
he's on the tip of my tongue.
He's starting, and then you have the guy from UCLA behind him, and then like 1 or 2 5-star recruits under them in quarterback position. So they're stacked.
Yeah,
they pulled the number 1 defensive end out of the Big Ten in Michigan State and put him on their team.
Wow.
They have both returning inside linebackers. They literally do not have. They've never had as deep of a team as they're kind of looking like an Alabama roster because of the transfer portal.
Well, the problem is that their schedule is maybe the toughest in Oregon history as well.
Well, because I mean, the Big Ten knew that Oregon, of the teams they acquired, was by far the best, and they were like, "We're going to just entertain everybody this year." It's Michigan. No. It's Ohio State at Oregon, and then Oregon at Michigan the following week. They play both teams back to back, so that's going to be a.
I think Oklahoma is having a similar schedule situation where they kind of.
I feel bad for them because they lost their quarterback and they don't have anybody else.
This year in college football is going to be the first time in a long time where it's going to be a very interesting science experiment just to see what happens when we start introducing these different programs in different leagues, where for so long you'd have the argument of like, oh, if this team played in SEC, they would never make it.
Yeah, that argument ain't working anymore
because now all the best teams are playing each other, which you just have Big Ten versus SEC in all reality. I mean, it's the most meaningful games. So it's going to be a very interesting football season.
Yeah, for sure.
I'm
looking forward to it. Yeah,
I had one last question here. The win total is 10.5. Over under.
Does that include bowl game or just regular season?
I believe
it's just regular season, right?
Regular season.
Yeah, they can't because they don't obviously know the postseason setup.
10.5 is that's hefty.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you think about it though, the Big Ten likes to talk a lot, but I'm sorry. What teams in the Big Ten other than Penn State, Ohio State, and Michigan hold or pull any weight?
Do you play Washington as well?
Yes, we play Washington every year, but Washington now has 0 team. Well, and they did maintain our Civil War rivalry. They just moved it to the 3rd game of the season instead of the last game of the season.
So 10.5 means you are an 11-win team. So it means you have a 1 loss. So it means you're beating either Michigan or Ohio State.
Yep, that's probably what they're hedging their bets on.
Which do you think you'll beat?
Oh, I was gonna say you probably have a better. I'm gonna go contrary to home field advantage, and I'm gonna say we beat Michigan because they no longer have a head coach.
I think Michigan will be definitely softer this year.
Yeah. So.
Oregon is also in the top 4 for odds of winning the championship at plus 850. I don't know if you know what betting odds are, but they're pretty high.
Not great at them, but this man's explained them.
Georgia's number 1, Ohio State, Texas, and then Oregon. So there you go. The sports books are high on
Ohio
you guys
State
as
makes
well.
me want to throw up.
Yeah, Ohio State always makes
Good
me
luck
wanna-
beating Michigan.
I actually hate Ohio State more than I do Alabama because of all of the pain they've given me in life.
Okay, well, Trent, thanks for being on.
Of course.
Thanks for giving us some insight. It's very interesting. We haven't had this kind of really pretty far removed from our realm team yet, so it's really interesting to get to hear a perspective.
We're always
from West
very
Coast.
heavy UT, SEC, or Jacksonville Jaguars. So
Correct.
it's nice to
I'm
have
glad,
Very
have
southern heavy. Yeah,
a little. Yeah.
I'm glad I could break up the monotony for you. No.
it was great. Yeah, it was awesome. Yeah, it was great. So Trent, thanks, and we will throw it back to ourselves.
Maybe.
Question mark.
It's a way to end it regardless.
All right. Thanks again to Trent for that interview. Really awesome. Be back with us again on Monday. We have a messing around episode coming at you. Make sure to check us out on socials, and we will see you on Monday.